in terms of the administrative work that goes behind the scenes, that the institution and the students and government have to go into to provide that service of higher education. That's not hand-holding. That's your job.
Yeah.
And it's not holding anybody's hand. It's fulfilling your end of this mandate or this agreement. From the moment the student contract is signed, the moment the student, when they get that letter of acceptance, presses submit on the digital portals, that becomes the duty of the institution. And it's not a holding of hand. It is the institution meeting their end of the bargain. The student's end of the bargain is to show up, go, work hard, get the degree, and then leave.
Yeah. Welcome back to Born Free, and today we're here having another conversation. We're speaking to the youth particularly, and we're speaking about the struggles faced by the youth. Otsile, Nkadimeng, how are you doing today, my brother?
I'm good. It's nice and it's cool today. It's fresh, it's cool, the air, it's stopped raining.
Yeah.
I'm happy.
Yeah. I think today's conversation is going to be a bit pressing because this has been an issue that's been happening in South Africa for now almost a decade. 2015 marked fees must fall. 2025 marked almost something that emulated fees must fall. We're having the same problem. We're having the same fight. And students aren't getting justice. Students aren't getting progress. Transformation seems to have stopped. And the promises of free education, better education, opportunity, all the things that were encoded in the ANC, which once was the ruling party, now governing in a coalition, no longer stands. I want to start particularly at 2025, the protest that happened this year. What was your biggest takeaway from what happened? And what do you think the response should have been from government?
Well, firstly, I think 2025 was a very muted form of what happened in 2015. And I'm not saying that from the ground. I'm saying that from the perspective of society.
Yeah.
Because it wasn't that well covered like it was in 2015. I think there was, and we talked about this, that there was a lot of fatigue going into this year's Fees Must Fall. Because there have been small dust up in the lead up to what happened this year. But I think it really only registered when people were on the ground seeing, firstly, strikes, hunger strikes at Wits University. Like, imagine people denying themselves food over accommodation and placement. This year was pretty much the meeting of a storm that's been brewing for a while. I think partly added to that, like the cost of living. Because I think people forget that a lot of the people that were also striking weren't also NASFAR students. Those were self-funded students. And in this day and age, it is ridiculous how expensive higher education is in South Africa right now. Funny that you started with referencing the Freedom Charter, because like thinking about this, I feel like we should be critically assessing that line in the Freedom Charter. The doors of education and learning shall be open for all. Have we actually aspired to that?
Yeah.
Because it's a question I've asked myself. We know the same type of intake of people that are going to enter the higher education system. Roughly, government can predict percentage-wise how many of those will be self-funded, how many of those will be NASFAS applicable. Why couldn't it be worked into fiscal framework? Or why couldn't it be budgeted into in the country to fund higher education for free? Like the promise was made in 2017. What's been stopping us? And I think that's what today's conversation we're going to unpack.
Yeah. I want to start particularly on the ground where these protests took place. Wits, UCT, Stellies, CPUT, all having some degree of protest, all having some degree of faculty response, but all having the exact same issue. Student debt not allowing individuals to register for the next year, not allowing individuals to graduate. And it seems to be a perpetual problem. Since 2015, on a year-to-year basis, we've had protests. We've had students who have been denied the opportunity to education. But particularly what I think is the most interesting is that instead of universities accommodating these students, universities have cracked down significantly more on those protests. From the discussions that I've had with SRC members, universities care significantly more ensuring that there isn't unrest, ensuring that there is lectures happening. And I think, yes, I do recognize in some capacity that schools and universities should operate. People should be given access to their education. Any disruption is a disruption that we shouldn't necessarily be able to deal with. But at the same time, I do say what do we say to universities that treat these protests as a moment of silencing students and refuse to actually engage? Because I think the most interesting thing that I found from researching this was the South African universities came out and said that actually, no, your anger is placed in the wrong way. We're not the ones who deal with debt. NSFAS deals with debt. So technically you're angry at us, but you're not necessarily dealing with the issue, and you're not necessarily dealing with the right people. What I did find ironic, though, was the thing that led to fees must fall in 2015 was a fee increase by the universities, public universities. What do you take on, firstly, the responsibility that universities have to play on the ground? But secondly, what do you take of the response by universities in saying that technically you're fighting the wrong person?
I mean, I think it comes down to the financial burden. So the universities on their end, they're saying that, listen, guys, to operate the facilities that we have to make us the world-class institutions you want to attend, to quote WITS and UCT in that space, we need money. And we have a problem here because you're saying you're not getting allocated. NSFAS is the one that's not paying. We provide a service. Fundamentally, we might be a public institution, but we are a business. And our business is education. So you need to go to the guys that are responsible for actually paying for your fees. But I think that neglects a fundamental argument. And that is that the relationship there between a sponsor and the institution, in most higher education institutions, typically the student themselves is never the one that has to be liaising between the two. Like once a sponsor agreement has been come to, the same way NSFAS, it'd be really great if NSFAS paid fees, guys. Like the most valuable company in the JSE, that would be great. That would be great. But I think the agreement needs to be more between higher education institutions and NSFAS and the government. I like that quarrel needs to be there. The lawsuits need to be there. At the point at which you have institutions maliciously instigating legal action against students for just daring to speak out about something that is burdening them financially, that is hindering their future, I think that we're really losing the plot. So I think also at the same time, we need to look at this. Like in my research, I was very interested to find how much NSFAS is actually working with here. So with a budget that exceeds 52 billion rands in the 2024-2025 financial year, most of this funding allocated towards tuition fees, allowances, accommodations, meals, transport, material. The fundamental problem is that NSFAS, like everything else in South Africa, is dealing with corruption. 52 billion rands where funds are being reallocated, driven around, pushed in accounts that people cannot track, people don't know where the money's going. The 52 billion that's supposed to be putting people through schools is disappearing, and institutions are saying, we can't eat that 52 billion. Well, not theoretically 52 billion, but we can't eat our portion of that 52 billion rands. Because WITS's vice chancellor always talks about the fact that their institution is a titanic organization that takes a lot of money. But then again, what is your endowment for? All of this money that you make every single year, we have roughly around 1.7 million students annually that enter higher education. But I think it's around 7 million or so students that apply to higher education. I can be corrected. I stand to be corrected on that. Universities charge an admission fee. They charge a registration fee when you apply. I remember this from my matric. 400 rands. 400 rands. 400 rands, that's how much you have to pay to apply at some of these institutions. And they profit roughly around 28 million rand every single year.
Yeah.
Are you telling me that that money cannot be put in an account or in some form of an investment that serves as a seed fund that allows them, in the short term, to cover just the basic re-registration on their end, subsidize the re-registration costs for students with enormous historical debt?
What I do think there, and I think the registration fee becomes an interesting point. And I remember when there was news media being written about it and people saying that actually universities profit off being able to deny students access to education, being able to deny them spaces, that they shouldn't be registration fees, or that they should be caps for what those registration fees should be like. Because to the average South African, 400 rand is a lot. 400 rand isn't necessarily something that they can access.
It's more than the SRD.
Yes. And so even if you were living on a grant-to-grant basis, you still wouldn't be able to apply. And there's a great deal of saving that you have to go through. There's a great deal of struggle that you have to go through. But I think more to that even is, if we just look at the education system in South Africa, getting to the point where you can apply to university is a major, major, major success. Considering that the majority of our education systems are overcrowded, there aren't enough teachers, individuals aren't necessarily getting access to textbooks, to resources, all the things that make schools what they are. So getting to university is a very important step, but even being able to apply to university is something more, because that means you've not only met the minimum standards, you've been able to get into those universities, you've been able to do the education. Because I think what becomes the most interesting is, it's not that we have students who are failing, being kicked out, that are the ones that are saying we want to get our education. It's the students who succeed. It's the students who spend every hour, every night studying, hour and hour, to ensure that they can get the best marks, to ensure that they can get their family out of poverty, to ensure that they can get the job. And yet it seems like these universities don't care for that. It seems like these universities are very quick to disregard the great deal of sacrifice that the individual goes through, but also the great deal of sacrifice that the family goes through to put a child through education. And to that, I think it asks a very interesting question, because who is responsible for a student at university? Is it the student themselves? Is it the fact that it should be the university? Should it be government? Where should we be stepping in, and who should we be putting the onus on when students aren't necessarily getting fed? I mean, there's an issue of students not eating every day, and there being food shortages because students just can't afford to live in an accommodation and go to university and get their food. Students are saying that they get sent to these universities unable to return because that's literally the last of the money that their family sent them on. It seems like everything and anything goes into ensuring students can get their education, but there isn't a guardrail to ensure that they're actually guaranteed the support that's necessary. So who do we go to?
Okay, so we have to unpack the complexity of this. So on a certain level, you have what we had at Stellenbosch University, where they said there's just not enough accommodation for the number of students that they had actually accepted. Hence why you had a housing crisis at Stellenbosch, students sleeping in the Nelsies, students sleeping in their libraries. So that obviously is an administrative failure on the part of the university, because they themselves understand during the registration process, they know how many students on an annual basis are registering and want accommodation, need accommodation. It's part of the application process. So that is a very obvious administrative error. But on the funding point, I think that is something that falls both on the institutions and on government. And the reason I say that is because there's a very complex thing to unpack there. And it always goes back to the history of higher education in South Africa, and the fact that the barriers that were put up to people of color meant that when democracy came and we suddenly saw the skyrocketing in the cost of higher education, that skyrocketing in the cost of higher education was meant to specifically price out a demographic of people. Even if it wasn't specific, it was definitely what was implicit in it. And as a result of that, the barriers that already existed, that, academia is a very stubborn space. So to actually transition that space, to transform that space, it takes a lot. So the barriers that already existed, it took longer for them to be deconstructed. Hence why the movement to still decolonize education is still strong today, because the movement has been slow and stagnant. But then we also need to talk about the frustration that the students have, because, a lot of people, and it's a very annoying argument, they say, well, if you can't afford, why are you here? Not understanding that in the workplace, there'll also be the same people that say, that these people are only here because of BEE.
Yes.
There's a compact, there's an agreement there. The agreement was, you go to school, you stay out of trouble, you don't get arrested, you don't do drugs, you get good marks, you go to higher education, and then you get a good job, and then you and your family get to live happily ever after in the modern South Africa in a nice leafy suburb. But when funding is a problem, that's not a reality. And it's not practical, and it's not anything people can realize. So the deeper argument as to why these protests exist and why the funding component is so contentious is that it is the students who met the criteria. They went to school, primary, middle, and then the later end of high school, secondary. They got through all of those phases, in spite of, at times, if they were at public schools that weren't that well funded, weren't that well resourced in infrastructure, textbooks, and educators. They got through there. In spite of that, they got the necessary marks, not only to pass matric, but to actually get university admission.
Yeah.
I think people also need to differentiate the two, university admission and the actual getting in. And now they get there, and the final hurdle is so far beyond what they themselves have gone through to actually get to the point where they're there at the university. They got the marks to get in. They didn't get in because of some DEI criteria.
Yeah.
They got the marks. That's why they're studying actuarial sciences or medicine. You needed the marks. But the funding is what's failing them. And on the part of the funding, it's unfair that the university is now holding them at ransom because NSFAS is struggling to pay, or rather is not paying, because they're like, I've come this far. I've done everything I've needed to do. The quarrel is not with me. It's with the NSFAS, the body. That's also similarly the institution's argument. But the institution themselves are directing that argument at the student rather than themselves taking the onus upon themselves to realize that the types of students they're actually pushing out of the system are the people that need it the most.
Yeah.
And that's why I say it's a very complex thing to unpack, because people need to put themselves in the mindset of someone in that situation. They need to understand where that anger is ruminating from. It's ruminating from having come all of this way, having met all of this criteria, having competed with all of these people to get this one spot at WITS, UCT, Stellenbosch, NWU, wherever, at a public institution in South Africa. And government fails to pay. And rather the institution taking it up with government, because they're a public institution, they're taking it out on you. Yeah. They're locking you out. They're stopping you from registering. They're stopping you from getting accommodation. Your meal vouchers are not enough to get you food. Like, I think that frustration boils from there. And the fault is very hard to blame because you have to segment it now. Because we're at a point where resources are, we're seeing with the budget, resources are about to get more scarce. The economy does not look like it's going to rebound in as quick amount of time as it's going to need to in order for us to deal with this
tariffs
efficiently. Yo! We can't say that word and not have me go, yo, because of how dumb the logic was behind those things. But anyway, I get passionate about these guys. I get really passionate about tariffs. But with the economy not rebounding in the necessary period, it has to. We're going to have to be more complex about this argument. We're going to have to be more strategic about how we actually start to assign fault here. It's very easy to put it all at the feet of government, but to a degree, government is also justified in saying, but what are these institutions also doing?
Yeah.
You know?
Yeah.
And that's the nuance that I think we have to get people into. But I think people also forget, and I know I'm like babbling on here, but I think people also forget that the original Fees Must Fall movement wasn't just about the increase. I forget the percentage point increase.
It was 10.8.
It was 10.8%.
10%
increase. It was also about the way the institutions had commodified education.
Yes.
And the entire system around that. And how inherently the education system was built in such a way that you had to afford it. But at the same time, the people who you are telling to go to school, you're pricing them out. And that's why it has this foundation and this very anti-commodifying of the education system. And it's not just a South African trend, it's all over the world.
Yeah.
And I think we need to then have a more serious conversation after this about the commodification of education. Because in a society that's ever evolving, development of technology, artificial intelligence, now more than ever, people are going to need to be more skilled, more equipped to be able to deal with the developments that are happening very quickly in the world. And the more we commodify education, the more we're pushing them out, the more we price them out, the higher the chances of social unrest we create in a society.
Yeah.
Because remember, I go back to how I started with this. There is an emotional part of this argument, which is justifiably emotional, and that is the fact that there is an enormous mountain to climb for people to actually get to the point where they get to higher education. We'll talk about what even happens after that with the unemployment rate, but let's start there. That is the most critical part of this conversation.
Yeah, I think the thing that becomes interesting for me, and particularly around 2025, was that there was an intent to go protest at the budget speech that was then postponed. It felt like for the first time they were taking it to government in the Cape Town region, and that it felt that government was going to need to provide a response. But as you correctly identify there isn't a wealth of resources. Government itself is having to deal with austerity measures. It's having to deal with negotiating a budget. And it seems like they're unable to help students in the way that they may have deemed. But I want to explore NSFAS a little bit more, because I think many of us understand what it is, but many of us are not considerate of how it operates. NSFAS qualifies for people who have an annual income of less than 350,000. And then there's the missing middle qualification of about 600,000. And already there's the missing middle consideration. That's a major concern in South Africa, that the majority of households make more than 600,000 but don't have enough money to be able to send their child to university because of the expenses, because of the accommodation, but they don't have the opportunity to go to a place like NSFAS to get a loan or to get a grant because they've been priced out. And we must also frame this in the background of the conversation of, if we look at the job markets in South Africa, more and more people are losing jobs. Unemployment is increasing. Poverty is increasing. Cost of living is increasing. Individuals already have a great degree of pressure that exists on them that they have to solve. And it seems like NSFAS isn't the system that's going to solve it for them. But I do ask the question, in 2023, when they made a very strategically blind decision to cut accommodation from 60,000 to 45,000. That placed students in an even more pressuresome situation. Because if you're a student who goes to any place where you live in a metro, where you live in a major city, it's impossible to find housing. Because there's not many places that are going to house you. You're competing with expats coming in, especially in places like the Western Cape. So what do students do about that? Where do students go? Because on one end, as you've said, universities are saying this is not our issue, unless it's an administration issue like Stelli's. But on the other end, universities, as much as they are here to give us education, should be doing a lot more to empower students to get that education. It can't be that we are just here to provide you with the degree. They have to guide you in getting that degree. And I know, yes, there's a lot of people who will probably push back and say, but university is not primary school, it's not high school. You don't need the same amount of guidance. You don't need the same amount of, I would say, holding of hands and crossing of bridges and everything. But I don't think we realize how many people come from small towns, small villages, who have never experienced a big city and now are hit with all these major pressures of finding food, finding accommodation, ensuring that they're even getting the correct mark so that they can get to the next year.
It's crazy how those things are framed as holding hand when it's basic to just providing a service.
Yeah.
And beyond that, I think people need to be less so much of a, we're not going to hold your hand here, and realize what their duty is, because it's a dereliction of duty to leave people without housing, leave people without food, leave people out of the education system. Like, when it comes to your lectures and stuff, like in terms of the modules you're doing, yeah, there we're not going to hold your hand. It's fine, because that's the actual practical testing of the work that you have to do in university and prove that you actually have gathered the skill and the knowledge there.
Yeah.
But in terms of the administrative work that goes behind the scenes, that the institution and the students and government have to go into to provide that service of higher education, that's not hand-holding. That's your job.
Yeah.
And it's not holding anybody's hand. It's fulfilling your end of this mandate or this agreement. From the moment the student contract is signed, the moment the student, when they get that letter of acceptance, presses submit on the digital portals, that becomes the duty of the institution. And it's not a holding of hand. It is the institution meeting their end of the bargain. The student's end of the bargain is to show up, go, work hard, get the degree, and then leave.
Yeah.
The institution has to ensure that they have the facilities, the student gets the right resources, and the student is able to be in an environment that allows them to study and get that degree and leave.
Yeah.
It's not a holding of hand. And so, I'm sorry, like, you're still going on with your question, but like, as soon as you said that, I'm like, we just need to cut that, because I know you're not saying it, but I'm like, we just need to cut that down before people get that idea of like it's a privilege or an entitlement thing. It's not an entitlement thing. They need to meet their end of the bargain.
I think what you say there frames quite a deal of how South Africa has dealt with this situation. That in South Africa, we have a class divide more than we have a race divide. That many of the people who are able to afford education, higher education, many of the people who are able to ensure that they get accommodation and they're able to self-fund themselves, or they're able to get more of the prestigious grants and sponsorships, that they don't necessarily understand or feel what it's like to be a student. I mean, the most disheartening things is hearing students having to sleep in like SRC buildings or having to sleep in the library, and that being a common way in which individuals go through university. And I think you're right to the extent of the conversation has been framed incorrectly when we think of it as a holding of hands situation, because for many people who do have the capacity and the capital, university is this like liberating experience. It's this moment where you get your independence. Yet for a majority of South Africans, university is one of the most stressful and scary experiences that's apparent. And so I do think to that, what do students need to be doing to help each other? Because I don't necessarily know if the government conversation, if the institution conversation is going to improve. On a year-on-year basis, we continue to fight. We continue to, every year, protest. We continue to be in the streets, talking to chancellors, leaning on our SRCs. But it seems that it's still a fractured conversation. Yet amongst South African universities, the 26 of them which do qualify for NSFAS, there's a feeling of if they came together, we'd be able to do so much more. And so from that standpoint, where do students get involved? How should students be getting involved, and what should they be thinking about?
I think one of the best things that came out of the 2015 Fees Must Fall movement was that there was a strong organization of youth power in South Africa at the time. I mean, the solidarity that struck from Rhodes from the Rhodes Must Fall movement, then when UCT had its Fees Must Fall moment to Wits, to University of Pretoria, and it just kept sparking up.
Yeah.
There was a strong sense of solidarity between the various movements and a strong sense of communication between the two. And I think perhaps those that were charged with ensuring that this type of an unrest never happens again within an institutional structure, if their job was to fragment this organizing capacity, I think they very much succeeded. I know for a fact UP students say that security is so tight on their campus. It's quashed before it can even start.
Yeah.
And so with that context in mind, I think then we have to look at the fundamental question is, what is the state of youth organization today? How organized are the young people today? How organized are the youth today? You know, it was something I had to speak about on a panel. And fundamentally the response was, we are not as organized now than we were then. And that is from the standpoint of solidarity. There's a lot of talk about solidarity politics.
Yeah.
Where is the solidarity? This year's Fees Must Fall, or early this year's Fees Must Fall, because there's one also last year, you know. This year's Fees Must Fall, I think we saw that underscored more than ever, where the same arguments that we're having in 2014 about, well, if these guys can't get their books and if these guys can't study, why the hell should they be stopping me from studying? Or why the hell should I not be going to class because I can go to class? It's a fundamental question of, as a generation, do we recognize that we are living in such a moment in South Africa where we will either rise together or fall separately? The logic in that being, if we look at this crisis that South Africa is facing, unemployment, inequality, and crime, the triple challenges, poverty, inequality, and unemployment. I'll add crime in there because it's featured in all of them. Each of these come from a lack of ability to access capital, access the economy, and access upward mobility as a direct result of all of those. Now, these things in the 2000s exacerbated crime to being as bad as it was in the 2010s. These things continuing in the 2010s made crime and all of these different issues worse in the 2020s. And ultimately, you know, during COVID, we saw just a symptom of what it can be like in the July unrests.
Yeah.
So generationally speaking, it's not a question of you're on this island on your own. It's a question of you're here, you're a warm body, you're accepted, and you are a key stakeholder to this institution because you are who the service is being provided to. Solidarity is not just in that classroom or there at that university campus at the time. It's a recognition that every student that drops out, that leaves, that is unable to be part of this process of getting their degree, going out into the job market, finding employment, and contributing to the economy. Obviously, the employment conversation we'll have at a later stage about that. But that process is not just an investment in a person, it's an investment in South Africa's stability, security, and its ability to grow and thrive as a country. And if you're planning on staying in South Africa, it's directly related to you because crime, unemployment, and poverty, everything we talked about, cost of living, the economy, the state of the rand, and our productivity, which makes us competitive with other countries. It's affected by all of these things. People need to recognize the interconnection here. And so I'm really preaching to that student with that mindset of, it's not my problem. Yes, it is. It's a national problem. It's a national issue and crisis. But to the point of organizing, I think that student leadership, I'll be honest, SRC politics has degraded. It is absolute hogwash. Like, it is hogwash. It's a mess. It's not where it needs to be in order for it to sufficiently make any significant changes.
Yeah.
One of the proposals I had to a friend of mine who's an SRC, I think at University of Pretoria, is I said that, the SRCs across the country, though they get elected at different times, I don't think it depends on who is elected for them to just come together, whether it's an outgoing administration and entering into a new incoming administration, to say, let's unionize our capacity.
Yeah.
Because I think for this thing to actually get the significant traction that it needs to, SRCs play a critical role in this. Yeah. But if they're not unionized across the country, we won't see the necessary level of garnering of political capital to move these things forward. I think it's like 2.8% of parliamentarians are young people. 2.8%. I think that's what I was told at an event recently. I should have double checked that before saying it on here. Fact check me in the comments, guys. But with that being the case, it shows that there's a significant lack of political capital in the legislative arm of government.
Yeah.
Meaning SRCs and student leadership should have taken it upon themselves to recognize that now is actually our time to unionize our capacity and our strength, galvanize and pretty much build a strong amalgamation of our political capital here. If you would, in NATO Article 5, an attack on one is an attack on all. Because I think that is the only way from this point to garner sufficient pressure for this to be taken seriously.
Yeah.
The pressure in 2015 and 2016 led to Jacob Zuma announcing that free higher education will be a feature in South Africa. It was the pressure. They couldn't handle the pressure. Albeit, this year's protests, they happened, but they didn't have the same roar. There wasn't the same level of solidarity. There wasn't the same sense of we're all in this together. There wasn't the same sense of let's try coordinate this thing. Obviously I don't know the back room. We know what happened behind the scenes, but as someone that was just watching from the side, I think it ought to have been obvious to the leadership at the time to say, comrades, let's find a way to work together with other institutions. Let's find a way to make our political capital more sufficient and more powerful. Because it's not just fees must fall anymore. Gender-based violence is also scratching for attention.
Yeah.
Unemployment is scratching for attention. Unemployed graduates are scratching for attention. Everything is now pushing for government's attention. And I think we must be very honest. It's very easy for youth issues to be pushed to the back burner.
I think student unity, youth unity, is a major thing that we discredit in our history. Considering that Steve Biko put together the Students' Association, but also was considered, and I mean history kind of plays around with it, but considered quite a significant part in 76. All these moments that moved our country forward. 76 is considered the turning point in apartheid. It was because of the youth. It was because of student leaders coming together saying that they were actually going to fight the system. They were going to refuse a system that continued to fail them, that they were able to get mobilization. Now, of course...
And they organize under the Black People's Convention.
Yes.
That's the organizing I need them to do.
Of course, 76 is by no means a pretty event. We also understand the consequences that came with it. But I do find it interesting because when I was listening to the Wits SRC president, he said they like talking about us. They don't like talking to us, but they continue to talk to the media. It's fine. We'll fall over in front of them if we have to. And I thought of that as such a interesting point of how far it's gotten, the radicalization that's occurred, the degree of fighting that students have to go to even to be listened to. Do you think institutions are doing their part, considering that they're public universities? Because it must be very clearly stated, to qualify for NSFAS, you have to be a public university. There's 26 public universities in South Africa. And the responses from the universities were interesting. The UCT vice chancellor spoke about how he doesn't like blanket concessions because blanket concessions put the university in debt. And the 2024's blanket concessions apparently led to 30 million rand in debt for the university. And in that same email, he then said, we've handed them over to debt collectors, so they'll deal with that issue. And I think there's an element to the inhumaneness, the business side of it, the commodity side of it, that continues to present itself and continues to push itself forward. But I think that juxtaposed to the amount of money that these people have paid. When we figured out how much the chancellor was paid, it was upwards in the millions. It was, I think, 7-8 million. And I mean, no, so Wits, 6.8 million, right? When students are protesting for a small 100,000, when we talk about the fees these individuals get, we recognize that universities, their faculty, their lecturers are being paid wealths of money. They're being prioritized. But we have to ask the question, how do you run an institution without students? And I think that's the concern that continues to show itself in South Africa, that there's almost an element of these universities are quick to say, okay, we're done with you. We've dealt with you. You're not going to get your education. We'll bring in someone else to fill your spot. You were just a number to us. And it never feels like the universities and the faculty ever comes down to speak to students at where they are, to hear students at where they are. I mean, I even remember watching the Stellies protests, and then Public Protector Thuli Madonsela had to come out after they deployed the police. Or I think it was campus security. It feels like students are at war with the institution instead of being in collaboration with the institution, with partnership within the institution. Where do you think we should be going with these things? Because on one end, I do believe we should expect significantly more. We should expect significantly better from people who understand and who lived through the liberation of this country, who understood what it took to get to that point and understood the degrees of violence and chaos that individuals had to go to be heard. If you're already seeing it on your campuses, and this is only the beginning, or potentially a resparking of what's been happening, barring the fatigue that's existed since 2015, because this is a year-on-year issue, there's an element to these institutions have to respond and have to respond better. Because without it, at some point, you're going to get to a point where you just aren't going to be viable. There won't be students who will be able to access your institutions. There won't be students who are willing to come to your institutions. And I know, yes, this sounds it is very theoretical. There will always be students. There will always be people looking for education. People are born every year. That's just the nature of what it is. But at some point, there has to be recognition for this system is just becoming infeasible, that people need help. Because I think the thing that's important to highlight in South Africa is that a university degree is the only way to get out.
Yeah.
Except corruption. That's literally corruption in a university degree. The only reason you would be corrupt is because you don't have the capacity to access capital. You don't have the capacity to access the economy to get a good job that's going to pay you the amounts in which you're stealing. On the other end, it's without a university degree, there's nothing that you can do. We don't have an economy that thrives in informal practices. We don't have an economy that allows for creativity to be the thing that's prioritized. And so when we think about it, it's really a university degree or nothing. And nothing comes with the consequences of being back home. Nothing comes with the consequences of now having to do something to make money, to make sure ends meet. And so there's a concern of, at some point, somebody has to say that we hear you, that we see you, and that we're willing to engage you at where you truly are. Because, yes, am I saying universities should be the ones to take the hit? No, I'm not necessarily saying that. But at the same time, I'm like, them making a loss shouldn't be their biggest concern. Their biggest concern should be how many people are graduating, how many people are they placing in the job market. And I don't know. I don't know what to say to it, because I think on one end, I'm able to understand what it takes to run an institution. I'm able to understand and respect the lecturers who get the degrees to ensure that they can teach the students. But on the other end, there's a part of me that just goes, but you can't keep treating everyone like a number, like a bank account that you're just going to extract from. Because if the only thing that you're saying is of value is the degree you give to people at the end, you're not really justifying yourself as an institution and as an experience that people should want to engage.
I think it's fundamentally ties to the argument that young people have spoken about in these issues but never actually there. It's time that they internalize that nothing about us can happen without us, that we need to be there. Furthermore, it has to go to the understanding that the culture around academia needs to change. And this ties to what a professor friend of mine said, but I'm not going to name them. I'm not even going to give a gender because I don't want any ties back to them. But fundamentally, universities used to be a space, and academia used to be a space that prided itself on the number of people that managed to bring inside, give them a good, fair education, help improve their idea of the world, help formalize their understanding of society, of the human condition, and just before letting them go back out into the world, also with a whole host of incredible experiences. Academia today, by and large, is premised on exclusivity. Yeah. How exclusive it is.
Yeah.
WITS prides itself on how exclusive it is. You didn't just get a degree, you got a WITS degree. So does UCT, so does Stellenbosch. You look in the States, Harvard, Oxford, Yale, the Ivy Leagues. Obviously, Oxford being in the UK, Princeton, US, Cambridge, and you just keep looking throughout the world. That is the trend. Universities now want to be the most exclusive. They want to be the coolest one out there, the hardest one to get into. But that shouldn't be the function of education. And that's why that culture has to shift. The universities run themselves on the basis of that kind of exclusivity. They want all of this money to have world-class facilities, which they should have, but in order to attract a type of lecturer or professor or researcher that other universities don't have, and then they can charge a premium on that.
Yeah.
It's the exclusivity of higher education that is holding them and holding us, the students, the young people, ransom. And I think there needs to be a returning to first principles. We don't want a degrading of a UCT as Africa's best university. Number one. They're number one at the moment, I believe.
Yeah.
We don't want WITS losing its prestige. We don't want the same for UCT. We don't want Northwest University being the space that it is, where actually quite a lot of young people are gravitating towards it because of the space where they feel that they can get their education there, but also have the types of experiences that will last them a lifetime, you know? But at the same time, we can't have a situation where that's all contrasted up against the provision of higher education. So it's not to say it's impossible to have these facilities, to have all of these resources, but as a result of that, keep people out. Is to say that fundamentally the model needs to change. So the types of people that sit on the Senate or sit on the advisory boards that advise vice chancellors, that advise heads of institutions, you know, there's a tendency now more and more for them to be business people, to be people from, you know, the corporate side. And I'm like, I understand that because you want to manage your endowment and you want to manage your funds and you want to have, you know, billions of rands circling around so that you can keep these huge facilities running and everything. But also at the same time, you must also understand that there is a need for a specific culture to exist in that space. And that is, whilst, yes, we want you to come in and help us manage the books and to give us advice, don't forget that though we offer a service, this mustn't be run like a for-profit business where we negate our main mandate and our main purpose, which is to help educate people. And so that's why I start with that point, nothing about us without us. These conversations have a few youth stakeholders, but often aren't driven by young people. You're brought on in a consultative forum. I think there needs to be an understanding that this now has to be a negotiation. There has to be a serious negotiation, and both sides need to, and I hate when I say both sides because it's like one side up against the other, but I'm afraid that's where the situation is now. They need to sit and they have to talk about this. There needs to be a tribunal-like forum for South African student representatives, because I think that they have the mandate to speak on behalf of South African students, and higher education institutions and government also needs to be at that table. Because that's the only way I see out of this. There is no, you can't leave it to them to figure it out in their own spaces, because they do very much operate in silos. They talk to each other, but they operate in silos.
Yeah.
They do need to be brought together, and the solution needs to be formed in that environment. It can't be discussed that, okay, this is what we're going to do and we're going to leave. It has to be discussed in that forum and committed to in that forum. What is each person going to do? It needs to be committed in that forum. That's sort of a tribunal. That's my recommendation, how I think this could be resolved, because I don't think the continuation of students deregistering, being academically excluded, financially excluded, because of the pressures that come from this mandate not being filled on the part of government and on the part of NSFAS and on the part of the institutions, it's a dereliction of our duty as a society. And I think we underestimate to what extent this is actually affecting us. Because this, in some way, in many ways, in fact, upends a lot of people's lives.
Yeah.
And I have to mention that because I think people forget that we're talking about lives here. For every student that is left out, there is somebody whose entire life, as they had planned it, as they had thought it, as they had worked hard to get to where they were, that is completely upended. What's the result of that? Lack of access to opportunities to get jobs, because we're always told you need to have higher education qualifications to get a job now. When you don't get a job, what happens? Your opportunity to get married, buy a home, have children, provide, and have a strong, stable life. At the most basic level, the most normal, live it to beaver type life, white picket fence and all, completely upended. People who stay out of the job market prolonged. The longer they're out of the job market, the less chances they're going to get of having a job. And then eventually, and this is where I'm thinking in terms of our generation, because I very much think in terms of generations, not so much decades. We're going to have a problem where we might have people in their 50s and 60s that have never held a job for longer than maybe a quarter of their life. Where will that put us? And the ones that do have children, where will that put their children? What will that do for our societal planning? What will that do for not just societal planning, but the mentality, the conceptualization of democracy, the trust in government and the institutions that exist to protect them? What will that do for our economy? What will that do for stability and security? All of these different things, multifaceted as they are, they all go back to this one thing being upended. And I think that's what people forget. There's a reason a life is thought of in cycles. Because you remove one cycle, you're going to kill the whole thing. And so, forgive me for being very philosophical about this, because I realize I went very philosophical about this. There needs to be that understanding that universities can't be exclusivist spaces. They are, in their nature, they shouldn't pride themselves on how exclusive they are. They should pride themselves on how good they are, but not how exclusive they are, because those two things can exist separately. You can be exclusive, but not be very good, and you can be very good, but also be very open, And so at the most fundamental level, that's where we should be focusing our attention. And so, yeah, hope I answered your question there.
No, you did. My question is, what do we make of government then? Because one of the things that's the most apparent is that NSFAS has had a great deal of failure historically. That's denied their ability to ensure fees are paid on time, to ensure individuals are getting access to their grants on time, to ensure people are being mobilized and being empowered in ways that they can actually maximize on their university and education system. And in that same tone, we've had people like Cyril Ramaphosa make commitments to building more accommodations, to make commitments to make the system better, make people feel better, make people feel held by the system. And yet many of those things haven't transpired. The free education of Jacob Zuma hasn't transpired. Students continue to be given false hope about a better country, about a better future, one that prioritizes them, one that speaks truly to them, one that engages them truly at where they are. And what do we make of that? Because on one end, I think as you correctly identify, government lacks representation from the youth. Government lacks dealing with youth issues. We see it with GBV. We see it with the problems now. But at the same time, we have a new government, a government that continues, if you listen to the DA, growth, jobs, employment.
Contemporary issues.
All of these things start at their core. They start at education. They start at the foundation, the building blocks that we have in South Africa. I mean, the most disheartening thing I heard was about that grade 4 statistic about people not being able to read for understanding. And that shows a continued failure within our country, a continued failure in our service delivery, and a continued failure in where we want to go and how we want to exist as young people.
Building a society.
And one of two things happen. Either one, you get significantly more people not able to fulfill their dreams, angry at a country, unable to do anything. And that's always a scary place. I won't necessarily say what that place is. I won't necessarily say what that can transpire to. But anyone who understands, that is the same fear that they had literally with the rise of communism post-World War II. They said a lack of job opportunity, a lack of education, people living in despair without the purpose of a job and work every day was going to make them turn towards communism, was going to make them turn towards a more left-leaning socialistic country. And so what I do find the most interesting is the rise of the EFF and the presence that they have on these campuses. Because throughout the SRCs, especially in the major universities, the EFF is continuing to be a presence, continuing to say that we represent people, continuing to say that we'll fight for you. And what I do find interesting is that the majority of South Africans, okay, let me not say the majority because technically I'd be lying.
Yeah.
But
consensus.
There's a consensus that South Africa can't go left. The markets say South Africa can't go left.
They don't want it to.
The ANC skeptical about going left. But we continue to put kids in incubators for left politics. We continue to put kids in places where revolutionary change or economic freedom, the things that the EFF continues to champion, continues to push forward, is the priority. And on that basis, I think it's very hard, and it's very hard for us to get a truthful understanding of where we are going as a country. But I do think that this education thing, depending on which political party weaponizes it, may be the one that moves it forward. Because we're seeing a failed system. We're seeing a lack of change and a lack of understanding from universities. We're seeing, I don't want to call it incompetence in governance, but I think it's just a lack of willingness and compassion to engage with the issues. And so where do South Africans go from here? What do you think is the likely outcome? I know it's not fair for us to speculate, but I do think we're on the onset of 10 years of this. It can't be another 10 years. It can't be that we continue to go down the same line, barrel down the same conversations, doing the exact same thing without ever getting the change, getting the actual recognition that's necessary for students to be empowered. Because a lack of a student population means a slowing down economy, means less innovation. Like, we don't understand how education is the thing that unlocks our economy. It's not the thing that will be unlocked once our economy grows, but it's the thing that will be doing the unlocking. And so when you have GNU partners, when you have the DA, when you have the ANC, all making a commitment to improve the livelihoods of South Africans, do you actually think that will be done? And if so, how do you think they do it through institutions of higher learning?
Firstly, I don't think we're speculating. I think we're scenario mapping.
True.
I think, firstly, any government that wants to continue to be a government needs to recognize that they need to, firstly, provide a space for higher education to exist, and they need not do anything that agitates what is referred to as the intelligentsia of their country. The fall of the Salazar regime was primarily initiated in a university setting with students. The fall of the Pinochet regime in Argentina, same, students within universities and institutions of higher learning. In Iran, when there was the revolution that took out the Shah and installed the Ayatollah Khomeini, it was university students that formed part of that overthrow of the Shah's government. So we need to, in fact, a lot of people that end up leading Iran were some of the students that led that revolution. So I think we need to realize that this is not just a practical thing, it is a national security imperative.
Yeah.
Business, I think they recognize because they're already seeing that they're unable to actually get the type of talent they want out of South African pool of workers. They're recognizing now. They need to educate people. Alternative paths are often talked about. But what we must not challenge is that fundamentally, for the majority of society, higher education is their way. There'll be those few that'll be the Bill Gateses, the Bezoses, the Larrys and Sergeys. But the majority are going to have to go through higher education in order to achieve the life that they want to. And so it's within that context, I think that government, firstly, I go back to my recommendation. They need to sit with these other parties, not political parties, stakeholders. They need to sit with other stakeholders and begin mapping out, okay, what is the problem on your side? What's the problem on your side? And we'll tell you what our problem is on our side. I think there needs to be a clear understanding of where everyone's challenge is. And then from there, because I don't think they have a fair understanding of what everyone's challenge is. And then from there, they need to begin mapping out a solution amongst each other. Because for this to work, there needs to be consensus. And if there's no consensus, and I mean, government says they're going to do this, and the universities say, we're not going to go with that. And in fact, we're going to take that to court. Already it's dead in the water. There needs to be cooperation. Much like for the GNU to work. For the GNU to work, there needs to be cooperation among the parties. For this solution to work, there needs to be cooperation amongst these stakeholders. If this continues, I don't think South Africa will be standing in a very strong place in 10 years. And when I say that, I mean any wind will probably blow us over into anarchy and destruction. We underestimate the critical role education plays in human development. One of the things that really scares me is that statistic you talked about of students at a primary school level that can't read for meaning and understanding, because that's loss of basic comprehension. What type of adults are they going to be? How are they going to be able to interpret information? How are they going to be able to interpret and discern away from fake news? How are they going to be able to run a budget? How are they able going to be... How will they develop their critical thinking capacities and faculties? Because reading for meaning and learning develops the comprehension part of the brain.
Yeah.
So we don't have that. We're going to have a society of people who are going to be dysfunctional adults. At a time where we're going to need adults level-headed, critical in analysis, and able as a society to breathe regular and move with where South Africa needs to go in order for it to develop and get better. Because they always say, it's on us. The adults keep saying, we need to fix it now. We failed. You guys need to fix it now. Well, we're here, but we don't have the tools of trade.
Oof. Yeah. Well, I think we're going to end it there. I think my biggest takeaway from this is that there needs to be a serious conversation and there needs to be serious action. That this is a sign of a system failing, a sign of a system breaking in on itself, a sign of a system that's unable to solve all the issues that it's created. And we don't know what will happen with the GNU. We don't know what will happen with education in 5 to 10 years. But what is apparent is that something needs to be done. Somebody needs to be heard. And I think that's what we'll say to people, is that continue to speak up, continue to fight. I know it's hard, especially when there's a great deal of fatigue, but that's the onus on us, that we need to continue to doing the things that people wouldn't do for us. And so, yeah, I think that's the biggest thing. To everyone who was at those student protests, you continue to be heard, you continue to be seen, and hopefully we do find a solution to this hard-pressing problem. Thank you, everyone, and we hope you enjoyed this episode of Born Free.